Hi, I'm Natasha Waugh and you're listening to the Film Ireland podcast. We were lucky enough to speak to Dr. Neasa Hardiman about her new film Sea Fever. Sea Fever is about a crew of a West Ireland trawler marooned at sea who struggle for their lives against a growing parasite in their water supply. On the surface, this is a thrilling monster movie, but it has science and humanity at its core. Neasa Hardiman, it's my great pleasure to be able to speak to you on the Film Ireland podcast. You are on the brink of imminent release of your debut feature, Sea Fever, after some amazing success with television directing. And a BAFTA. How many BAFTAs do you have?
I got a BAFTA for Happy Valley.
Happy Valley. I was lucky enough to get a ticket for this for Dublin International Film Festival, and I have so many questions, so hopefully we'll get through them all. But I just want to start with, I suppose, what your intentions were with this film, because I think you have really interesting intentions. And one thing that I took away from your Q&A afterwards was the quote from Zosha Zaks. And she said, "The ship of humanity, we need all hands on deck to right the ship of humanity." And you said this film is about the ship of humanity needs all hands on deck. So can you tell us a bit about that?
First of all, it's a pleasure to be here. So the film is what I was trying to do with the film is to hit that sweet spot between the pure language of cinema, which is the language of metaphor, the language of analogy. It sort of lives in that Brechtian space where you make something that feels like a dream, but like a dream, it has proper depth and resonance and meaning in the real world. So that was the intention behind the film, is to hit that sweet spot between something that is imagistic, but also has a political resonance.
Yeah, and I think it's so great that your cast was quite diverse. It was quite intersectional. You had people of colour, and you had a woman in the lead, and it was just a great cast.
There are two sides to that, really. The first part is because it's set on a boat, and I'm really nerdy, so I did a whole load of research.
Cool.
And there were a couple of things that I learned in terms of intersectionality about the boats, about the trawlers off the west coast, off the west coast of Europe, actually, not even just off the west coast of Ireland. The first was that it wasn't something that I imposed on that story. It is something that emerged naturally out of the research. Those crews are really, really diverse. They are transnational by their nature. That is partly because the work has become increasingly hard over the last 50 years through overfishing and through globalization. Those small boats of 7 or 9 people, which are owned by family, really struggle on the edge of an economic precipice. And the people who work on those boats tend to be people who are struggling on the economic precipice. So you get a lot of people who are migrants. Sure. You get a lot of people who have escaped from war zones. You get a lot of people who are very skilled and very able, but who are struggling to find their way into their place in a new society. So that was a very natural kind of outcrop of the research was, God, these boats are really transnational, and that's a very natural thing. The other thing that was so interesting about the research was the first person that I reached out to was the skipper of a boat that fishes out of Russellville called Cleana Keneally. And she was brilliant and really helpful. And she read the script for me and helped me to make it really authentic, going, this is what we do and this is how we do it. And these are the moments that are the most critical and this is where the most injuries happen. And all of those kinds of details that I wanted to be absolutely right. Yeah. And she introduced me to her husband. And I forget his name now, but he's Icelandic. Okay. And she's a kind sort of Gulkish from Russellville. And I went, well, it's really unusual you have an Icelandic husband. And they both kind of looked at me going, no. And of course, then she was telling me, they log their departure point on GPS with the Coast Guard, right? So they're supposed to say, we're leaving Russellville, we're going up to, I don't know, Reykjavik, and then we're going up to, I don't know, somewhere else, Oslo, and then we're going to come back down. But she said, actually, because everybody knows each other, what they do is they say, we're leaving O'Brien's, and then we're heading up to Olaf's, which is the pub they all go to in wherever it is, Reykjavik, and then we'll be up in Bjorn's, which is the pub they all go to. So they all know each other, and they're all connected to each other, and they all share a history, and they all share stories, and they all marry each other. And there's something really lovely about that. For me, I hope for the people who are watching the film, because we live in a world which is increasingly kind of nationalistic and increasingly obsessed with borders and identity and nationalism. And to meet a community of people who are so fluid and who are so open to anybody who can contribute and anybody who has the skill set that they need. And they create these transnational families where it doesn't matter how you wear your gonads or how much melanin you have in your skin. If you're good at your job, you're in. And there was something really gorgeous about that I wanted to reflect truthfully in the story.
Yeah, and I absolutely love that. And I think it's so needed in today's climate where we are thinking so heavily about borders. I suppose this film, like, it's like I've read a couple of reviews and articles, especially from Toronto and stuff like that, and they're talking about this as a big monster movie. And I feel like it is a monster movie. It's a very cool monster movie. It reminded me of Alien, but at sea. But it has a very distinct moral compass, and I think that's something that was picked up a lot too. Like, this is that. But it's wrapped up in a monster film. So I'm just wondering where that came into it. Like, why not just make a story about a bunch of people at sea? Why bring the monster into it? I'd love to know more about that.
It's a really interesting question. I'm going to answer it in two ways. So if I forget in the middle, you have to tell me that I've forgotten, bring me back. So the first thing is, you're absolutely right. There are two ways to read the film. And there were people in Toronto who read it, oh, it's a horror flick. Yeah, it isn't. And it's in that interstitial space between a cinema that has a political meaning and has a resonance and is metaphorical, and something that is a cinema of spectacle. And that's intentional. And if you read it as a horror flick, you've missed the point. And it was great because a lot of people in Toronto really got it. They really got it. And I'm really thrilled because our American distributor came to me going, this isn't a horror film. We're not going to market it as a horror film. This is a psychological thriller. Yeah. And I was just so thrilled with that, because I know that the people who go to see the film thinking they're going to see a body horror flick are disappointed, because it isn't. It's a psychological thriller. And it has a deeper meaning. It's intended as a metaphor. There was a second part of that question now. What was that?
Just, I suppose, where did the monster bit come into it?
Where did it come from? So essentially, what I wanted to do was I was really inspired by filmmakers who managed to hit that interstitial space really well. So the films that I was thinking of were things like Crouching Tiger, or things like Arrival. Or, you could argue about how successful it is, but films like Annihilation or Another Earth. So films that are using the language of popular cinema and of dreams to articulate something that's possibly a bit deeper, or to talk about ideas, to ask questions, hopefully to make the audience feel something and ask questions. And that's really where I wanted it to live. And the kind of central conflict in the story is the conflict between magical thinking and the scientific method. And that grew out of when I was thinking, okay, I want to make a film. I don't want to make a film that's only going to live in an art house audience space, even though that's my background. Sure. I come from a visual art background. I was very tempted and drawn into that world, and I started out in that world, and that was really enjoyable, and I speak that language and I love that language. But I am very aware that to a certain degree, when we're raising those ideas in that community, we're preaching to the choir. And what I wanted to do was to emulate those filmmakers that I saw as, I think Martin Scorsese talked about it as putting a grenade in the middle of your film. So you make a film that you hope will reach a wide audience and will have enough of the pleasures of cinema, the pleasures of narrative cinema, which are, spectacle and great tense narrative and a proper, exciting adventure, a big life, but that also have this grenade at the center of them, which has a kind of radicalism built into it that doesn't tell people what to think, but that asks people to see the world from another perspective and to ask questions. And that's really what I wanted to do with this film, was to wrap in the language of an exciting psychological thriller, something that is a kind of ethical and emotional grenade about the nature of the culture that we live in. So I felt like I'd seen a lot of films that vilify the role of the scientist. And again, you know, apropos of what we were talking about earlier about, you know, nationalism on the rise, 2016, I think it was, Michael Gove going, we've had enough of experts. We see that around us. There's a palpable rise in this idea that you can't trust people who are academically able, or you can't trust people who speak in the language of a particular discipline. And particularly you can't trust scientists, as if scientists were somehow uncoupled from ethics or uncoupled from human morality. And actually, you see it in mainstream cinema again and again and again and again. You know, as if the subtext is don't mess with God's work, or something like that. You know, don't overreach. You know, Prometheus, that kind of myth. And I fundamentally and profoundly disagree with that. And I fundamentally and profoundly disagree with the idea of hunches and the idea of magical thinking and the idea that we should believe what we want to believe. And that fundamental idea of how the film should be, of course, it leads you bang straight into climate change. Because climate change is where scientific method and wishful thinking, magical thinking, have butted up against each other in the most horrible way. And when you're trying to tell a story about small-scale survival fishing off the west coast of Ireland, you're telling a story about climate change.
No, but I absolutely love that grenade metaphor. And, you know, it's something I talk about a lot. I suppose reaching to my own work, but only because I love films that have, that say anything, I suppose, that have a bit of a social conscience, and do so in an interesting way. And somebody said it's like hiding vitamins in ice cream when you make a monster film that's actually about environmentalism, diversity, and, you know, borders, all this kind of thing. And I love the idea of a kind of a sexy scientist, and kind of like a scientist I love that she was responsible rather than being so distant from humanity and saying, I mean, I don't want to give too much away, but by saying to them, you know, we really need to isolate ourselves from all of this. And
it is weirdly
so
on topic at the moment, like, because it deals with the ethics of contagion. You know, how do you square potentially sacrificing one person to save a broader community? How is that right? And is that ever right? Or is it better to try to save that one person but potentially jeopardize an entire community? And suddenly those ethical questions are really pertinent.
Like, you could not have timed that better. I mean, like, how do you perceive, like, do you worry that because the timing of it is now and that we're all thinking about, you know, coming down with coronavirus and, you know, your film kind of, is that a spoiler? No, isn't it? Like, do you worry about how it might be perceived now?
One of the executives at Screen Ireland very wittily said to me, you know, I know this is a coincidence and you're very lucky your film's coming out now, because if it came out in 2 months, people would accuse you of doing this on purpose.
That's true. No, that's very true. That's very true, actually. So it's funny that I just want to go back to the scientist thing and kind of talk about your lead character for a little bit, because I thought she was great and she really defied a lot of expectations. And one of the other films I saw at DIFF this year was Radioactive by Marjane Satrapi, which is about Marie Curie. And Marjane Satrapi did a Q&A afterwards, and she said, you know, it's really hard to, you know, she said a lot of science and scientific stuff that sees on screen and cinema, she said it's usually very unsexy and it's kind of boring and it's kind of painted that way. And so her whole thing with Radioactive and telling Marie Curie's story was to make it sexy and to make it appealing. And she played this amazing love story in the middle of it all. So I just want to, like, can you talk a little bit about your lead character and a bit more about kind of science being the hero of the story?
I think that's really well put. I think science is the hero of this story. So there are a couple of things I want to say about the lead character. First of all, I have to say Hermione Corfield, who played the part, I would work with her again like a shot. In fact, I've already booked her. I think she did an amazing job, because the character that I wrote, what I wanted to do was to articulate and probe and investigate some of the cliches that we have around scientists in cinema. And some of the cliches that I perceived were this notion of disconnection, this notion of being separate, of being unemotional, of not understanding human connection. And I started to kind of drill down into that, going, okay, so where does that come from? And what is that? And one of the books that I was reading during my research was Neurotribes, talking about people who are on the autism spectrum are often quite drawn to science. Not that they're particularly good at science, in comparison with anybody else, but that science allows people who are on the autism spectrum to focus on something where the things that are very difficult and challenging for them don't really come into play. So Henry Cavendish is sort of the poster boy for that. Okay. Incredibly intelligent, able, articulate, smart, revolutionary scientist who paved the way for modern physics, who found it very, very difficult to make connections with people, who was very shy, who tried to separate himself from people because it was very frightening for him, because he didn't really understand the nuance and the subtleties and undertones of emotional communication that we engage in between each other. So I thought, okay, well, that's really interesting. So let's drill down into that and let's produce somebody who has those characteristics. So she conforms to the stereotype in a lot of ways. And then let's kind of pull back the curtain on what really is going on there. Because in my story, Siobhan, who's the central character played by Hermione, is perfectly able. She's perfectly happily and effectively living her own life. And the areas that she really struggles with are nuance, subtlety, interpersonal connection. And it's not, I think the big point to make is, it's not that she doesn't want those things. It's not that she's not lonely. And it's not that she's not hurt when people misunderstand her as cold or unable or uncaring. It's that she's trying to protect herself from the rejection and from the hurt and from the mistakes that cause her to hurt other people. And so she's kind of withdrawn. And at the beginning of the story, we position her in this kind of glass space where it's completely pristine, it's completely clear, it's a really intellectual life. And she has withdrawn from trying, from human connection, from trying to make intimacies with people, even though she would really like to, because it's so difficult and it's so painful. And it, from my experience of people that I know who live with this kind of cognitive difference, it can result in bullying, it can result in isolation, it can result in a lot of pain. And so people who, it used to be referred to as Asperger's syndrome, who are cognitively different, many of whom are incredibly able and really smart, like Siobhan is, sometimes experience bullying and experience exclusion. And so what Siobhan has done in that instance is she has withdrawn from social communication because it's just too difficult. And she can do this other thing really, really well. So that's what she does. So what I wanted to do then was say, that's the origin of the myth. That's the origin of the screen presentation of the scientists that we see. It's not that they're amoral. In fact, if you were hanging off the edge of a cliff and you were on a rope, you would want Siobhan on the other end of that rope because she would never let go. She would never let go and she would drag you up with her last breath. She is the most moral, the most ethical person on that boat. And she is the person who is the least susceptible to wishful and magical thinking. She is the clearest, she has the clearest view of what's going on, but she's also genuinely really ethical. And that was kind of the argument I wanted to advance for that cliche image of the scientist. And sorry, I feel like I'm talking a lot here. But no. The other thing that was really important to say then was not only people who are cognitively different are scientists. There are other people who are more neurotypical who also make great scientists. So I wanted to pair her with Omid, who's the second lead in the story, who is a really brilliant engineer. He is equally analytical, and they can almost finish each other's sentences even when they meet, although they don't get on, because they have the same kind of ability to withdraw what they wish were true and look at what they can actually perceive and try to piece together what's really happening without engaging in wishful thinking. And the thing about Omid is he's perfectly emotionally able. He's warm. He has lots of friends on the boat. He's really emotionally connected. So it's not that being a scientist means that you're emotionally disconnected.
And I love that that's so well put. And I think like by the end of it, I was really rooting for her You know, like even when, like she has a bit of chemistry with Jack Hickey's character, and I was like, yeah, get it, girl. Like, I was so like pleased. I was kind of pleased for her, and just by the end of it, I was kind of proud of her. I don't know, there was something going on. Yeah, there was definitely a connection I found there. And it's so interesting that you mention Omid, and she's the first thing she says to him is when she sees this amazing work he's built, he literally designed. She says, why don't you have a better job? Which I love. And he's just like, well, this is kind of all I have at the moment. Do you think, just something that came to mind when you're talking about kind of misunderstanding those kinds of behaviours, do you think that's gendered? Do you think women are more susceptible to being misunderstood in that situation than guys?
It's really interesting you asked that. It's one of the things that Hermione and I talked a lot about when she was preparing for the part. When she was thinking about it, when she was hanging out with people that she met who were neurodivergent and who were talking to her about their experiences, and she was just kind of, bringing them to parties and observing both the physical and the intellectual differences between her and these people so that she could try to embody that more truthfully. And one of the things that she said to me was, it's very liberating.
Oh.
It's very liberating as a woman because, of course, we're trained always to perceive and act on the needs and emotional frailties of the people around us. We're trained since childhood to do that, and we get rewarded for that. Mm. And if you are neurodivergent or cognitively divergent and you struggle with those things, there's a kind of directness that, I think it is certainly punished harder in girls than it is in boys. But for Hermione playing that part, the ability to be that direct was strangely liberating. And you were talking about, there's a moment where she articulates her desire to Jack Hickey's character, and that was the moment where she went, this feels so different. It feels so different from how I as a woman in my life would ever behave. And I think, a lot of the women on set really resonated with that, going, it's so, she owns herself so much, and she owns her own agency and her own desire without thinking twice about it, going, this is what I want.
No, I had such admiration. I know I don't mean to like put all that stock in that one moment, but I was just, again, I thought about it as like just there thinking I would never do that. Fair play. I would never do. That's brilliant. And I just, she's such a great character, and she's one I can't wait to hear more about from other audience members, I suppose, who are kind of thinking about those kinds of themes. One thing I really want to talk about, and this is kind of, not necessarily talking about the movie itself, but rather the development process that I'm really, really curious about. Because am I right in saying that this has been in development, or I suppose incoming, for a long time?
Yes and no. I think it's one of those things where I had the idea a while ago, and then, you put it aside, and, I've been lucky enough to have other projects that have come to fruition. So you as a writer and as a director, you take the opportunities that are presented to you. So other opportunities presented themselves, and I went and did them, and then you come back to this and go, oh, maybe it could be something slightly different, and then you go away for a year and do something else. So it sounds like, I think it was like 4 years, something like that, and it sounds like a long time, but actually in reality, you're looking at it and then going away and then coming back and then going away, and maybe that's useful.
Yeah, I suppose so. Yeah, I mean, did it always have, like, I'm just thinking about what you said about, the inspiration of seeing those refugees on the trawlers and stuff like that. It's just this ongoing research that you kind of come back to and take away from all the time.
Yeah, I think that's true. Yeah, you are absorbing things from around you all the time. And that was very important to me as well in terms of how we populate the boat, that there's a way of telling stories about underrepresented communities and women where you make their underrepresentation the fulcrum of the story. So, stories about women, which are stories about sexism, or stories about people of colour, which are stories about racism. And that's important because those things are true. And they are genuine cultural stumbling blocks that people face because of, the bodies that we are in. But in some ways, I think there is a counter-argument there as well that bears some consideration, which is we need to make sure that those aren't the only stories that we're telling, that we're not just telling stories about sexism, or we're not just telling stories about how women fail And we're not just telling stories about how people of colour fail. Even if those stories are couched in the reason for the failure is, sociocultural and to do with structures, ultimately we're still telling stories about how those people fail. I think it's important for us to also give underrepresented communities their full humanity, our full humanity, and not to limit ourselves to the ways in which we are discriminated against, but rather to valorise the ways in which we are fully human. And for me, in terms of telling the story, that's what I wanted to do. So at one point early in the process, one of the producers said to me, would you consider making Siobhan the only woman on the boat? Because then, you're stating her difference as gender difference or sex difference, as well as cognitive difference. And I thought about it and I thought that's actually the opposite of what I want to do. I want to make her sex not relevant in this story. And it was really important to me to populate the boat 50-50 because that's the world we live in. And we don't all go around going, I as a white person or I as a woman. We go around thinking of ourselves in terms of the amalgamation of our experience and our skill set. And that's what we bring into the room. And it's, of course, inflected by, whatever your experiences are of privilege or disadvantage. But there are other things in there that I think are worth valorising and talking about. And I wanted to do that with the women, and I wanted to do that with the people of colour, and particularly with Mead, who in the middle of the story you discover is a Syrian refugee. And I wanted to position him very sharply and clearly as a Syrian refugee, as somebody who came on the boats. And then also to say that does not define him, that experience inflects his understanding of the world, but it does not define him.
I think I loved that we found that it was kind of like in the background. What we knew him to be was this exceptional engineer. And I'm just like, is it a preoccupation for us to automatically go towards sexism, racism as it being like a plot point or some sort of narrative device to kind of move this story on? Like, is that something that we're too preoccupied with?
I mean, it's a difficult question, isn't it? Because you don't want to elide it. You don't want to say this doesn't exist, because it does, and it needs to be talked about. And one of the ways to talk about it is to problematize it in narrative cinema. That's really powerful. But personally, I feel we do ourselves a disservice if those are the only stories that we tell.
Yeah.
And for me, I feel like my role as a filmmaker and what I want to do in terms of my screen storytelling is to tell stories where people who are traditionally underrepresented have proper agency and are fully human, and to really experience the world through their eyes rather than problematizing their bodies.
I'm going to move on and talk about something that actually I almost asked you at your Q&A, which is the boat. I'm going to talk about the boat because I loved the boat and I loved the set, and I want to ask you about what it was like to shoot on the boat, and how much was the boat and how much was a set, and where was the set?
I'm so delighted you're asking that question. Because, if you as a fellow filmmaker don't know, then nobody knows.
Yeah, no.
So that's good. What we did was we shot for 7 days on the actual trawler, which is called the Fort Angus. And we took it out to sea, and the actors all got sick. And because they were all really, really committed professional people, everybody except Hermione, because she didn't have to know how to do it, learned how to gut fish and learned how to operate the winch, and Connie and Dougray learned how to pilot the boat. So they all took it really seriously, and they were, some of them were better at it than others. I won't lie to you.
Yeah.
Connie Nielsen could gut a fish in like 20 seconds. She was really impressive.
Yeah.
So we did that for the first 7 days, and we had Cleana and her brother on the boat with us, showing us the ropes, quite literally, teaching the actors, laughing at them when they got it wrong, all that kind of stuff. So that was hugely valuable. And then we took that experience with us. I did think, first of all, that we might shoot the whole film on the boat. And then when I actually got onto the boat and had a look at it for the first time, just about 3 months before we were shooting, I thought, oh, Jesus Christ, we'll never even get a camera in here, let alone, 80 hairy crew members. So, because of course space is at a premium, you live cheek by jowl. It's so intimate. So what we did instead was we recreated the boat on a set. So the designer, Ray Ball, made this entire trawler on a set in Ardmore, and it was complete. So you could climb into it and walk through the whole boat and climb the ladders and go into the fish hold and climb the ladder and go back into the cabin and come back through the galley. It was the entirety of the boat with ceilings and working electrics and everything, so that the actors could feel properly trapped. Because you need that claustrophobia. But the advantage for us as filmmakers was it had these segments that you could take out, so that the camera is always inside the space, but sometimes the lens is just at the wall. So we take out a little bit of the wall and put the lens in the wall. So it never goes outside the space. It's never further out than you could physically be. Sure. But we were able to keep the 80 hairy crew members then outside of the set rather than all crammed into this tiny little, which they wouldn't have fitted into anyways.
Sure, I know. I was just, because I was thinking that when I was watching it, because I thought the scenes where they're kind of down below deck and having dinner and stuff, I was thinking that has to have been a set. Like, there's no way you can wedge. The amount of times I've been on a set at a recce with my DP who's like, you're not gonna get that shot you want because it's like tiny. We're in a box. Ray's great, by the way. I have no Ray. He's such a lovely man. I haven't seen him in years.
Oh my god, he is such a lovely guy and so creatively able. He's just brilliant.
Yeah. What are your sea legs like?
I have Quells, seasickness tablets that you take 2 hours before you go on the boat.
Oh, did they work?
Oh god, yeah.
Okay, I'm gonna remember that next time I'm anywhere near some sort of raft or whatever.
I was like a pusher by the time we got to day 2. The actors were like, "Do you have any more of those tablets?"
Did you learn how to gut fish? Like, did you do everything that they were kind of? Did you learn how to do knots and things like that?
No, I did not. No, I had Cleana telling me this is what the actors should be doing, and then the actors were much better able to do than I was. I was just behind the camera going, "That looks great."
Well
or
done.
Do that again. It's a bit slow.
Yeah, don't make a song and dance of it. Like, yeah, I say that's my favorite. Just don't make a song and dance out of your time. I was kind of. I mean, I know you've mentioned Annihilation and you've mentioned Arrival, and how. I mean, how much did you draw upon from? I mean, I'd actually talk about. I would love to hear you talk about, film studies as well, because another film scholar of mine, a good friend of mine, who was in college with me, said the more you know, the more you can rip off. And I thought that was that was kind of a crass way to put it. But I mean, is there any specific influences? Is there anything you did in your film studies time that has greatly influenced you in your work? Because I know for me, I was, surrounded by so much interesting work from all sorts that I hold dear and take with me.
It's Delacroix, I think, the painter, who says, learn your craft, it won't stop you from being a genius. And I think it's really important. And I know you share this. I feel like there is an unnecessary gap between film theory and critical, like properly engaged critical analysis. I'm not talking about reviews. I'm talking about properly engaged critical analysis.
Absolutely.
And film practice. And I think for us as filmmakers, it really behooves us not to get caught up all the time in the how, but to really focus and drill down into the why. So for me, and you and I share this, I have a terribly nerdy academic interest in film and in film analysis. Yeah. And in analysing the language and the grammar of film and what films are doing. And this sounds really, really nerdy, but I'm just going to go ahead and say, because I know I'm among friends, my PhD is really about this. What I did with my PhD was I wanted to look at that idea of the grenade inside popular cinema. How do we, because what I know from making mass stories, from making stories that screen to big audiences across. I'm not blowing my own trumpet here, but when you make big TV drama, it screens across the world. And what I know from that is that you can be quite radical in terms of the stories that you tell, if you tell them in such a way that you are drawing people in, both with character and narrative tension, and that people will go with you on your radical journeys. And I know that from Happy Valley, and I know that from Jessica Jones. And what I really wanted to do was to bring that knowledge with me into cinema, that we can tell stories that are properly radical. Because what do we know about storytelling? What do we know about screen storytelling? We know that we make culture. The number of people that will quote cinema lines to you as words to live by, the number of people who will talk about having seen something in the cinema that changed the course of their lives.
Yeah.
There was an article recently was it in the Harvard Business Review that was called the Scully effect. And Scully is the woman who was played by Gillian Anderson in The X-Files.
Yeah.
And she's a scientist. And the Scully effect is, during the years when The X-Files was screening on television, the number of girls who chose STEM, which is science, technology, engineering, maths, who chose STEM subjects for third level went up. That's making culture. That is making culture. And we have a duty and a responsibility to know that that's what we're doing when we tell screen stories. I'm not talking about propaganda. I don't think we should be telling people what to think. But that old adage, if you can see it, you can be it. We do have a responsibility to do that. We do have a responsibility to populate our stories with diverse people, with underrepresented people, and to give those people big lives and adventures where they have agency.
Yes, I could not agree with you more, because this is something I love to talk about, and I talk about how we as filmmakers have a responsibility to use our platform as a voice, as a tool for social change.
It is anyway,
yeah.
I think.
Yes.
It is anyway, regardless. I remember, years ago, interviewing Ken Loach. And I asked him, what's your view when people call you a political filmmaker? And he said, all films are political. You think Die Hard isn't political? Die Hard is really political. It's just
so
really
political.
right-wing.
No, but it's true. Like, everything has, like, the amount of, like, I did a class when I was doing my film studies degree on the cinema of the 1980s, and I was, like, we were looking at aliens, and we were looking at Back to the Future, and I remember people asking me, well, do you not think that, like, does that not ruin films for you, and do you really think the filmmaker intended for it to be like that? And I was like, I don't know, maybe. Does it matter? Because there's a cultural influence there. And again, my thesis actually for my master's was also on exactly that. It was examining a very particular time and place in America, Black Lives Matter, but also how that was reflected on screen by filmmakers like Get Out, because that's Get Out's a horror film, but it's saying so much about racism. Exactly. Yes, so I absolutely 100% agree, and all these people have, like, it's the most important social medium that you have. People do it together, right? And it's where people get all their information about society and popular, like, people get their perceptions of everything from popular culture, right?
I feel that it's our duty and responsibility to be aware of that and to articulate an enculturating worldview. I think it's our duty as directors and as writers to do that. Because, like Ken Loach says, every film is political. Every film is political.
What's next for you?
At the moment, I'm making a political thriller. It's a thriller, an international mystery thriller for Netflix. So that'll be out in the autumn. And then I'm hoping to make another film.
And how do you find working in television? Like, I know that's a stupid question. That's such a broad question. I suppose
it's an excellent question.
No, as an emergent filmmaker trying to break into television, what's that word? This is a question I get asked a lot, and it's that there are more women in TV than there are in film, and why do you think that might be? Why do you think there's more space created for female directors?
It's a myth. The level that I work at, which is what I've just done is 8 million an hour, and once you get over $3 million an hour, the number of female directors drops to 4%. The way that those numbers get calculated, you can do it 100 different ways, and the way that is most telling is by budget. There is plenty of room for female directors in art house cinema. There's plenty of room for female directors to tell small stories about underrepresented groups, as long as they're not over $2 million and as long as they have a limited release. But if you want to tell stories that are genuinely enculturating, that will genuinely reach people who don't have the money to go to art house cinema once a week, then that's where the power starts to become really apparent.
And that's something actually I was talking to somebody about today, is how the bigger the budget, like, women don't necessarily get big budgets all the time, which is like, there's only like a very small amount of directors who are women who get big budgets, and I can't, like, it feels like we have a long way to go.
I think this is really an issue of trust.
Yeah, it is.
You know, you and I take very seriously the fact that when we make a film, it means somebody is giving you millions of dollars or millions of euro on the basis that you're going to make it good enough that they'll get their money back. And that's a very serious responsibility. And, you know, our job is to make it to the very best of our ability. But while we are committed to doing that, there is also on the side of the financier the assessment of risk. And I think that's where, you know, sexism and racism come into play again. I think it was Gina Davis who said, nobody is expecting the next Kubrick to be a woman. And what we're seeing there is unconscious bias, is, you know, financiers who are going, well, if I'm going to risk my 10 million, I'm going to risk it on somebody that I think is going to do a good job. And so then they're making this kind of magical thinking, not very rational assessment just on the basis of, you know, how low somebody's voice is and whether they look masterful when they come into the room. And all that, I'm joking now, but, you know, unconscious bias is really about those things. It's magical thinking at its worst. And unconscious bias works against women and people of colour.
It certainly does. And that's, again, unconscious bias is something that I think about kind of regularly, especially now that we're kind of in this climate where, it's, at least in Ireland, things are trying to be turned around. And like, what do you, this is a hard question, but how do we, like, in a sentence, how do you,
is it maths? Because if it's maths, that's really hard. No,
no, but how do we change that?
You know what? I think it's easy. I actually think it's easy. I think this is an incredibly easily solved problem. It's about recognizing what's going on, and it's so easy to fix. You know, we all you know the joke about two goldfish swimming along, and this other goldfish comes towards them in the other direction, and the other goldfish says to the two goldfish, "Hey lads, how's the water?" And they go, "Yeah, fine." And then the two goldfish swim on, and one turns together going, "Oh, it's water." And that's, we all swim in the water, right? All we have to do is know what the water is, know what it is. And I think, you know, if you are a woman working in the business, or if you're a person of colour working in the business, you know what the water is because you see it all around you. You see the obstacles that are put in the way of you and of your colleagues who are, you know, underrepresented. You see it. And I think the risk is that sometimes if you are privileged, it's actually really hard to see. It's really hard to see because you don't experience it anecdotally and personally. So you don't actually know about it. And so for me as a white person, I constantly have to be going, what is the water like for people of colour here around me? And as a man, I think your job is to go, what is the water like for women around me? And just be aware of that. Be aware of it. And I think being aware of it solves the problem.
Dr. Neasa Hardiman, it's been such a pleasure to talk to you. Thank you so much. All the very best with Sea Fever. I cannot wait to see it again and for other people to see it. When is it released in cinemas?
24th of April.
24th of April.
Buy tickets early and often. Lovely to talk to you. Thank you so much.
Well.